All right, it is once again a Monday, and it's May 1st, so happy May Day, Oleg. Thank you for joining me on a holiday for you, at least. So I do appreciate you hanging out with me randomly here on a Monday, and I know it's evening for you, so good evening, sir. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. So,
thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm glad this all
Good
worked
question.
out.
I mean,
Yeah.
the podcast is called Between
Chair and
Chairs,
Keyboard.
right?
Yep, Between Chair and
Is
Keyboard.
is it the pun on the Galifianakis between two?
Yeah. Yes. So I can't remember what my original title was, and then it sort of hit upon me that, well, actually, this should really be problem exists between chair and keyboard, and I'm like, yeah, between chair and keyboard. That's what we're going to call this thing. And
right.
My whole purpose was to try to have some non-technical conversations with technical people. I mean, selfishly, this started for me as a way of recapturing the hallway track at events when we weren't going anywhere and we were all stuck at home during the pandemic. And it's just kind of continued for me because it's just kind of fun to hang out with people on random Mondays. So I enjoy it, and seemingly a handful of people show up occasionally to watch it. So
no, great, and thank you for reaching out.
Yeah, well, thanks for being here, man. I appreciate it. So, Oleg, I'm going to start where I suppose. Let me put up my welcome banner. I always forget about that. So welcome. Appreciate you hanging out with me. I want to start where I always start, which is origin story. How did you find your way into this technology space? And then we'll definitely delve into the Spring bits too. But how did you decide to be a software person?
It's actually an interesting question. When I came, I mean, I don't know, like I'm thinking like how far along should I take it? But let's just say that there was a time, so like when in the early 90s, I was doing COBOL development. It was, it paid the bills and it was fairly easy. And I can have many funny stories about how my manager was, like micromanaging every single thing, literally giving me the code to write after he already tested it and put it back together, like, right? So, but it just, the programming was at that point of time. I like the fact that I can, change a few things, and all of a sudden, like I like automating things. That was my sort of that's what I found. That's the passion point that I found within programming. But it became very boring very quick with the once I saw the first PC basically in a silo. It was if you remember, like in America there was a chain silo, like a pre Best Buy thing. So. And I was like, all right, I want to get into something more interesting. And so basically I started learning C++, Visual Basic, and Java by myself, like bought myself 4 books. And at some point of time, I decided that I'm going to start, sending out the resume. And I was sending him basically on all 3, like whichever sticks, right? So, and I could tell you that I was equally unskilled in all 3 of them. But, I tried, and so the first job I got was doing Java, and thank God it happened that way because I never looked back. But I just remember that the first program I wrote in Java was literally like 1,000 lines of code, and I just decided, it was me sort of like rewriting my last COBOL program, and it ended up to be like literally a COBOL written in Java, and that's when I realized that. Okay, now I have to learn the object orientation and everything else because this was like a really new thing back in the and that's how it started. And after that, I just started learning more and more because I just realized the power of what it can do compared to what I was working on and the type of application, the type of environment, what we're doing. I was like, well, this is interesting. But yeah, so that's really like I said, I can spend an hour talking about this, but I'll stop right here.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, I remember teaching some folks Java, and the part that really stuck for me was learning the grammar, the keywords, the tokens. Like that's pretty straightforward, especially when you've got a couple languages to compare to. It's the way you then think in that language that's the stretch. And I remember taking some folks who'd spent a lot of years writing COBOL, helping them transition into Java, and that was one of the big sticking points for almost all of them was how they structured their code. And I remember one guy complaining to me like, Nate, I don't like the fact that there's code all over the place and I got to change it here and here. And in COBOL,
the procedure division, the COBOL program was sort of read from top to bottom kind of thing.
Right.
and yeah, but I mean, yeah, you can in object-oriented work. Obviously, the program is just it's a container of methods, and there are certain rules, like the public static void main. That's what JVM will execute. Everything else is whatever you call, right? So yeah, but that's just like with any other language. I mean, there's got to be an entry point, and then from that point on is entirely up to you.
Right. And it is frankly not that different than learning a foreign language. I remember when I was in college, I very distinctly remember when I transitioned from translating in my head into Spanish and back and forth to I was just thinking and speaking in Spanish. Now that's all since vanished, since I haven't had an opportunity or an excuse to continue to flex that muscle. But it is interesting how that takes time, and that I don't think there's a way to rush that.
You're absolutely correct, because obviously English is not my native language. I came to America in '91. I had a good vocabulary in me. I couldn't speak a word. Like I could put like some basic sentence together. But the point is that there was a period when, as I was progressing, there was a period where I no longer I stopped translating, and just so you understand, right now, it got to the point where my primary language right now, if you ask me, like, what's my first language? It's actually English. Russian, Ukrainian is the secondary now.
Sure.
So I dream, I think, in English as opposed to other language. Like don't even ask what language we speak at home, because it's a mix. But with my son, I speak English. So, but that's like I said, it's you transfer, and right now it's the same thing for me with French. I'm at the stage where I'm still translating, but I'm in certain sentences or certain phrases, I am getting to the point where it just goes.
Sure. Yeah, and it's funny how some of that still sticks around. We were watching something over the weekend that had some Spanish in it, and I caught maybe like 30% of it. And my son is, I would say, almost fluent, and he went to an immersion school, so he's further along in the Spanish than I certainly was at his age. And so it is kind of interesting when you catch those little snippets, and your brain's like, okay, I caught that word, but what was the thing that came before it, and what did that mean? And
well, it's not even what before, it's what I learned, because right now I'm surprised how much of English I can hear just from the background and noise and everything else. I was like, I actually heard everything, and then I realized I only heard a few words, but between those two words and a few sounds that I heard, it could have only been that, and you kind of like deduce the context, and all of a sudden you're like, yeah, I got it, and then you understand that yes, your English right now is, your brain is set for English, not for any other language.
Yeah. So we talked about that part, and you and I had a rollicking conversation in the pre-show, but how did you get into the Spring world? I know you've been there quite a long time. So how did you find your way into Spring?
So just as I was talking about how boring it got for me to do COBOL and Azure and Java, so fast forwarding 2007, I was working for a company called Unisys, which is basically the other IBM, the other mainframe. And we were doing some interesting stuff there in terms of telecommunication. I learned a lot there, some really hardcore stuff, but the company itself just had no direction, anyway, I wasn't, it got to the point where I didn't see any future there.
Sure.
Right. So, but now I'm traveling to North Lobster staff conferences and this and that. I'm learning all this, Spring, Hibernate. I mean, those things are just coming out at that point of time. Well, they were already, I wouldn't call them, even 2007, 2008, they were not mainstream. They were still sort of like a cutting edge. People were like, well, open source wasn't all that mainstream either at that time.
Right.
So, so a friend of mine, a colleague who actually also ended up working for Spring in the later years, Tom McCutch, we just decided to go to a Spring experience in 2007 in Hollywood, Florida, to literally look for a job. So, and this is when we approached, because we kind of knew some people from some conferences and some education classes and stuff. So we knew some people, and we started looking. We basically approached a few people, and one of them is one of the founders, Colin Sampaliana. he's like, yeah, I'll let you know. Like, I got my phone number. Said I'll let you know once something becomes available. And 2 months later, I was actually on a business trip to Tokyo from Unisys, and I land and I check my email, and Colin said he has to interview somebody really quick because the opening became available. And I'm like, Colin, I just landed in Tokyo. Can we like do it tomorrow? He's like, oh, actually, I need to find somebody right away because so I'll call you when something else comes up. I said, no. Okay, if it's really that urgent, let me get to the hotel at least. Yeah. So yeah, and so I'm after flying, I don't know, for better part of 24 hours, and now crossing the international what is it, time zone, right? And
Yep.
so I have no idea what time it is,
Right.
which part of the
It is.
it's just your day, like a day, night, whatever. So
Mhm.
and so we're in a hotel. I put my wife and son to bed, and I went back to the business center. It was like maybe like 2, 3 in the morning, and so I got on the phone and I'm interviewed by Colin, and it went on for almost an hour, and I thought we were doing well, and it felt like it's going to an end, like a wrapping up, and then the next thing he's like, "Do you have access to the email?" I said, "Yeah, of course." He's like, "Can you open up? I just send you a piece of code to review." I'm like, so,
It's 3 in the
and
morning.
so it got to the point where there was a time I said, "Colin, listen, I'm literally falling asleep like as I'm talking to you." So he's like, "Oh no, you did fine." So the funny thing is that this summer, him and I reconnected. Him and Nina were traveling through my area, so we met,
Mhm.
and we were just remembering that. And he was like, "Oh yeah, my goal was just to keep going until you crash."
Oh God.
So
Boy.
so yeah, and basically, so 2008, I came to Spring. They just switched from Interface 21 to Spring Source. And one thing I also remember, like one little point, that I was the 99th employee of Spring Source because we had a wiki, and my
Yeah.
last name starts with a Z, so I was always at the bottom of that spreadsheet. So I'm like 99. I'm like, yeah, I made it up within 100. Yeah. So, but yeah, it was started as a consultant training, and then back then everybody did pretty much everything, but
Mhm.
some of us were dedicated to do this, and then engineering in between, and then about a year and a half in, Mark Fisher, I started contributing more and more to Spring integration, and then the opening became available in the proper engineering team. So, well, team,
Mhm.
if you call it. It's like every other team in Spring Source, like 2 people, that's a team.
Right.
So yeah, that's yeah.
Oh, and Simon is here with us today. Hi, Simon. Glad to have you. Simon's one of our, I'd like to say, super commenters. He shows up on a lot of our streams. So thanks for being with us, Simon. Appreciate that.
Cool.
It's funny how that stuff works. I am fairly confident that we may have briefly overlapped at that particular instance of SpringOne because
I've seen you, I've heard of you. We just never really connected over like at the in one of the parties or something. But for example, I don't know if you remember, but you're the one who queued me up 2 or 3 years ago when we did during the COVID when we did the virtual thing, Springbound virtual. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I've heard your name throughout my sort of a tenure. Like somehow, I know of Nate Schutta. I just never connected the dots. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's I always try to remind folks this is a pretty small community ultimately. It may seem like it's huge and it's amazing how much overlap there is between people, and then you start to realize like, oh, actually, yeah, you were at this company shortly after I was, and I
Right.
actually had one of my students last week. It's like, hey, I wanted to bring up a name with you, and I said, oh yeah, no, she and I overlapped at Pivotal briefly, and and they had gone to school together. They'd overlapped at
Right.
school, and I'm just like, yeah, that's play your favorite small world earworm right
I met
now.
my math teacher from a high school in a grocery store here in America, from a high
No.
school over in Ukraine.
Oh my
Just like
God,
run
that is
into it,
crazy.
yeah.
That is
So that's
crazy.
how small so it's not just
Right.
IT world, the world itself is really small. 8
Right.
billion
Right.
people, that's
Yeah.
not that much.
Well, as an aside, I mean, that is one of those things I find really interesting about the world that we inhabit. The fact that, you're in France, I'm here in the middle of the US, and yet the world has gotten a lot smaller that way because it has gotten so much easier. I can't remember what show we were watching, but it was one of those things where, well, to get from here to there is going to take like 6 weeks. And now that's an 8-hour flight. And, it's kind of shrunk that distance quite a bit.
I tell you, one day, my wife and I would cross from Italy. We would decide to take a road trip. We cross into Switzerland on the Italian side, and our final destination was to get to Munich.
Mhm.
So we're driving. We stop here and wherever, and then I was always fascinated with Switzerland, such a small country,
Right.
3 distinct languages and stuff. I'm like,
Mhm.
it would be interesting to see the separation. Like, how is it separated between, like, it's not like, okay, this house will speak Italian and that house will speak French. No, there's got to be some natural sort of a. Next thing I know, we're approaching the tunnel, and it says tunnel is 22 kilometers or something like that, fairly long.
Mhm.
We come out on the other side, I don't know, 10 minutes later, 7 minutes later, snow is blasting, architecture is totally different, and it's a German side. And I was
Right.
like, okay, so think about this way, with this tunnel, with a nice modern car, it took me 5 to 10 minutes to get through this 20, 15 kilometers. Now
Right.
imagine back in the days when there's no tunnel, you have to get a horse and carriage and go around the mountain or over the mountain. And that's your natural divide. I mean, that's
Right.
really, it's like it may be bird fly, maybe very close, but the physical way to get there is so difficult that it might as well be a whole other world there, and you don't know about it.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, and then with some of the technology we have, I know we were doing a golden path, I don't know, last week before, and we had folks from India. There was somebody from Australia. I mean, we had folks from all over, and I just thought that was so fascinating. Of course, Neil makes a good point. So Neil's a friend of mine here from the cities, and we're not that far apart, and yet it took a long time for him and I to overlap. We were at the same org for a while. He was helping us out, and then
Neil.
Neil Busing.
Okay.
He's in the Kafka space these days, and so I mean, it's he's been kind enough to lecture my grad students periodically,
Okay.
and so yeah, I mean, well, I know personally that there have been folks where even if we live in the same city, it's easier for us to get together when we're on the road because then your calendars are more likely to line up than when you're actually at home. Because when you're at home, you've got family duties and you've got hobby duties and you got other things. The next thing you know, it's
Right.
like, oh yeah, we could meet in July. I think I have an afternoon free. Or if we're both in this city, hey, that's actually easier. But
Right. Exactly.
now
No,
this is something we touched on a little bit before, but you've been working remotely for a long time. I've been doing this for 6+ years, and
yeah. I mean, so basically, the last few years in Unisys, it was remote, and then obviously once I joined SpringSource, it was all remote from the get-go.
right.
So I would say from 2006, so that's what, it's 14 years plus 3. Yeah, that's 17 years. Yeah.
That's a long time. Do you have any like
There's,
tips or tricks or things that you've adapted to? Or I mean, because I don't think I could go back at this point. I've been doing it for 6 years. The idea
I
of going back into an office does not fit with me.
so first of all, the problem with the office is not the office itself. It's the fact that, like, we tried this in Philadelphia because when I was back there, we actually have about 4 people in the in the general region. But then you realize that, what do you consider a general region? Because if Gary, for
Sure.
example, lives in King of Prussia and the VMware office was 10 minutes away from him, then for the Sobia and Artem, it's an hour and a half commute from the suburbs. And
Right.
okay, for me, it would be also a little faster. So, and we were sort of considering maybe we could have a like a very flexible sort of like a call like at Tuesdays or and Thursdays or something, like 2 days a week where
Mhm.
we can, because what I notice, and I do it right now a lot remotely, is that if I'm thinking about something and it's like a new feature or whatever, or I wrote some complicated code and I want to discuss it with somebody, I can ping Gary or I can ping Sobi and just listen, let's just chat because I need to argue with somebody and with somebody other than the wall. And
Right. Right.
and so like I said, be devil's advocate, push back on me, like literally. It's almost like if you remember like Dr. House. I mean, he has a
Mhm.
whiteboard. He's like, argue with me, tell me no to everything I say, right?
Mhm.
Like kind of like that. So So that's what I think is missing from the office environment, is the fact that I
Sure.
could just turn around, like, hey Ned, what do you think about this, and then run this idea by you and show some piece of code and argue with you, and so that's what I missed. But
Sure.
obviously, unless people are already generally co-located, it's going to be a little hard. Now,
Mhm.
the other part of the question, so now with Zoom and everything else, we kind of adapted to the collaboration. So, and it's actually it works for me pretty well. I have no problem. I like my hours, I start like afternoon usually. So I crisscross with the East Coast United States. So which means
Sure.
I have plenty of time to talk to my colleagues. So that's fine. But the other part is how do you organize yourself?
Right.
Because you can literally, with the phone and everything, you can literally, be still in bed and start working. Like you
Right.
don't even have to get out and brush your teeth and wash and everything else. You can. So obviously, I just disconnected my phone from all corporate things except for Slack.
Sure.
Basically, giving somebody a less chance to get in touch with me if they really, really, really need to.
Right.
But like no Outlook or nothing, which almost contributed to this meeting be not
Hey, it
happening.
all worked out.
But yeah, but I think it's a little self-organization, and I'm like my wife would be laughing right now if she hear me saying that, like would be required, because like I I'm known to work pretty much in every part of the house, and
Sure.
but right now we're in the process of renovating, and there's one section, one addition to the house which is actually not connected to the house in any way, kind of like. And when we were discussing it with an architect, and I said, no, I want to keep it this way. I want to convert it to an office, but I don't want any door from it to the house. I want to leave the house, go to the office, and
Interesting.
come back. So in other words,
Okay.
it's still attached to the house. It's still part of my house, but it's not
Yeah.
will not have a physical connection to the house. I would have to physically, rain or shine, leave the house
Okay.
and go to work and come back. So
I know multiple people who have a similar sort of ceremony or activity
yeah,
they do to signify the start of the day, the end of the day. Like I used to work with somebody who, when he worked from home,
that's what I'm
he'd go,
lacking right now. Yeah,
right, right. So what he would do is he would go out his back door, walk around the side of his house and walk in the front door. And then at the end of the day, walk out the front door, walk around the side, come in the back door as that mental trigger. I do it, and my wife laughs about this, but I have different clothes basically that I wear. I have my work from home pajamas, t-shirt and shorts.
yeah.
But then at the end of the day, I switch out of that into
Put
my
on a tuxedo
work.
and
Well, yeah, then I get all dressed up, right?
yeah,
Yeah, that's another thing I'm broken for. Like I can't go back
right.
to wear like khakis and a button up. I don't think that's going to happen again in
Oh
my
no,
lifetime.
no.
But it's just some kind of a trigger to tell your brain on or off, and because those boundaries are hard. I mean, I think that's another part of this that we also talked about a little bit in the pre-show. It can be really easy to work significantly more hours. I know in my previous gig when I didn't have work from home, I could only do it periodically. I put in way more hours when I was working from
Yeah.
home because I got up at the same time and started working. And then at the end of the day, I'm like, oh, I just want to finish this one thing.
Well, part of the problem is like I know a lot of people who are in the same boat, is that like at which point of time does the work actually stops also?
Right.
Like sometimes, I mean, just because you're not coding, I can a lot of times, like I'm in bed and I'm thinking about something because something is
Mm-hmm.
bothering me or bugging me that I cannot either figure out, or how should we do that or whatever. And you and I both know that that is the longest thing, because once you know exactly what to code, coding is the easiest part of the job. I always try to
Right.
explain to everybody, coding is really, really the simple. Look, I don't even understand why they're paying us all this money. That's a very simple job. But what's not simple is get to the point where you actually know what to code.
Right.
Yeah, so it's organizing yourself and how to, like, for example, for me, to the point of how, like, I was trying to figure out which the train of thought about my last comment. To me, to disconnect my brain, I found it might be one of the hardest things to do, because even when for example, when I cycle, I tend to like just go in a zone and think about
Right.
coding. I was like, so cycling, while I enjoy it immensely, did not disconnect me from thinking about code. You know what did?
Sure.
Cooking.
Interesting. Okay.
So cooking is one activity, and I got pretty good at that. So it's one activity where you cannot think code and cook. Something
Sure.
will get messed up, guaranteed. So you have to really
Sure.
concentrate. So yeah, so for me, for example, is like basically I took over the responsibility in the house just because of that. So my wife, she cooks, she's an amazing cook, but I cook more just
Okay.
because that lets me disconnect
Right.
um, from work.
Oh, that's fascinating. No, I know exactly what you mean. I've been playing around with this little personal app to scratch one of my itches. And yesterday I was banging on something and it just was driving me nuts. And I couldn't put it down. Like my wife had a thing, and so it was just the kid and I for dinner. And Everett's like, "What are we having for dinner?" And I'm like, I have no idea because I have to solve this. Like, I can't even
Yeah,
think about that until I figure out what's going on here because it was just driving me nuts. And I was thinking about that. I think coding is unique in that it is so flow state inducing, that
yeah,
you could get into that zone and then you're like, oh my God, it's been 3 hours. And I'm sure other occupations have that as well. I can't imagine we're the only one, but that's definitely part of this. And well done, Neil. Too much salt in the hash if you try to code and,
right.
and think about code while you're cooking. But
Yeah, too much salt.
yes, well done. Well done.
Yeah,
So I think that's one of those interesting pieces to me about this job, that it really does sort of
basically, yeah.
accommodate that or force that.
You have to figure out for yourself what works for you, what doesn't. But the most important thing you have to learn, if I were to give one advice, you have to learn quickly. The first problem you have to solve, how to separate work from home, because
Yeah.
when work is home and home is work, and I'm not talking about kids, wives. No, I'm talking about your person, you yourself. Like at which point of time you can say to yourself, "I'm done working."
Right.
Like, and what do you do during that time? Are you walking
Mhm.
around and checking your phone for the emails and saying, "Oh, I got to get back" or whatever? No, we're like, I mean, yes, we do want to maintain a certain level of extra responsibility, be reachable and stuff, and keep because that's just who we are generally, right? So that's why, like I said, I kept Slack on it, knowing, and
Mhm.
obviously people who need to get in touch with me know my phone number too. So
Right. Right. Yeah, and I do think that is one of the challenges, and I know that's certainly something that has come up a fair amount, seeming in the last couple of years, is sort of burnout within this space and preventing it, dealing with it. I know last week, or I guess it was a couple of weeks ago, my guest, that was one of her things that she was talking a lot about was that, and I do think that that's something you have to guard against, and it can become all consuming, especially when you're working from home, but
right.
it is important to have those boundaries.
Oh, I want to share something with you
Yeah.
because it's interesting to get your take on that. So I had during my heavy travel days, I had a very interesting experience traveling to Canada, especially from Philly. It was basically to Toronto, typically like
Mhm.
a 45-minute flight or something. Very easy. But for me, the crossing as a U.S. citizen, crossing the border into Canada has always been a little bit of a hassle. I don't could never understand why, because they would ask me like, so what is the purpose of being in Canada? I said, I'm here at a conference. It's like, so you're on business? I said, well, I don't know how to like answer this question. And
Mhm.
he's like, so you're working here? I said, you're getting paid. I'm like, I'm just getting paid as part of my, So I got in this conversation with this officer, and we got into this big debate, and I have to tell him. So I said, listen, let me explain to you this. Let me explain to you what I do. So I explained to him what I do. That I'm an IT guy. That I write code. Blah blah. I said a lot of my job involves thinking. So at
Uh-huh.
some point of time, we were crossing the lake, and I was thinking about the code.
Right.
So was I was thinking before we cross into Canadian territory and after we cross into Canadian territory. So how would you qualify in terms of like like was I working in Canada and should I pay
Right.
tax? Like how would you
Right.
quantify quality? Like I you know it it for whatever reason it's always happened to me that I with the Canadian authorities I would get stopped and have this
Yes.
conversation. Eventually they would let me go, but it was just did anything similar or only with Canada.
Yeah. Yeah. The Canadian border has always been a little interesting, especially given the fact that we have such a long border with Canada. And I know just about every time I've crossed in, you run into those kinds of questions. It's gotten a little easier lately because it's become a little more automated, and you just have the little scanner that takes your picture and then you hand something to a person on the way out. And so there's a little less of that direct human. So why are you here? What's the real purpose? But I certainly had some experiences, in the mid aughts there where you had to be very careful with what you were saying. And they were very particular about you doing work in Canada without the proper visa. And so you either needed a letter from the company that you were going to work for that said, yes, this is all above board, or whatever the language was, or the typical answer was, I'm here for meetings. And then they usually can't do a whole lot about that because, well, I'm meeting with someone here who has a business.
I was actually flying for the conference that was like literally not a big conference. It was like a little client-facing conference. And since I live such a close, I was like, I flew in the morning to come back that same day home. So I said, listen, dude, I'll be out of your country in about 6 hours.
Right. I'm not going to be here that long. And I mean, I love Canada. Canadians are amazing people. Too. It's an incredibly friendly place. I love it. But the border was sometimes an issue. I had a friend of mine who did have a problem crossing in, and he was a little grumpy. He hadn't slept well, or it was an early flight. I don't remember all the particulars, but he basically got you're going to have to go that way, and you're going to have a delay, and you're going to spend a few hours talking to a border person. And so you do have to be a little aware of that.
One day I was coming back to the States, and I was extremely tired. Maybe I had a few drinks on the flight. It was a long flight from somewhere from Asia, and I just US guy, asking typical friendly questions, and I cannot even open my mouth. I'm like,
right.
Like, are you okay? Said, are you? Said, oh, I'm sorry. Let me concentrate. Yes, I'm okay. I'm just extremely tired.
Right.
Anyway, sorry.
I ran into that coming back from Europe at some point earlier this year. I had a very early morning flight, and I was going through airport security, and seemingly they change the rules on a periodic basis, and they don't bother to update you. And so not only did your iPad and your laptop have to come out of your bag, anything that has a cable in it has to come out. And so, of course, they don't tell you that until the bag already goes through. And then the woman's like, do you have any cables in your bag? And I'm like, yeah. And then I laughed or something. And then she's like, was this funny? And part of me's like, yeah, it kind of is, because, you can see the cables, and I go through security a lot. And this backpack has the same stuff in it every time. So you're going to find what exactly, but you can't argue with them because they'll just say, okay, well, then you're not getting on the flight.
You just, okay. Yes, sure.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
You cannot argue. You cannot show frustration, because that feeds.
No, they don't like that.
Feeds them,
They don't like that. So I think Simon had an interesting comment here, and this is something that you were kind of hinting at, which is, you load this problem into your brain, and we talked about this in the pre-show. That's the part that takes a long time, and then trying to get it back in there again is challenging. And your point about writing the code's not the hard part, and there's that joke, whatever it is, about guy's got a problem with his car, and he takes it in, and mechanic opens the hood and looks around and bangs part of the car, and it works. And the guy says, that'll be $100. Like, well, $100, all you did was hit the part of the car. It's like, yeah, it's $95 to know where to hit it and $5 to hit it. And it's like, that's the same thing for us. It isn't the typing of the keys that's the challenging part. It's going, okay, how do I translate that into code?
Brings an interesting question. Remember back in the days when your performance as a developer was evaluated by LOC, lines of code? And right now, one of my favorite commits is when how in GitHub you can see how many lines of code was added, how many was removed. And I'm like, when the number of lines removed is greater than lines added, and you're committing a new feature, I was like, this is a damn good code.
Yeah, that's a good day.
That's a good day, a good code. It just everything is just going well. So imagine it's like the old mentality of evaluating a performance based on line of code is like, how many lines of code? I actually removed 1,000 lines of code. Oh my God, why'd you do that?
Right.
So
right. But I think that's I think we were talking about this in the pre-show. The whole work in the office thing, the idea that a manager can somehow tell what you're doing by physically seeing you, versus, well, what features or what did you get done this week, this month? I mean, I think that's one of the challenges some people have, is the idea that when we're in a remote environment, the butt in seat time is no longer valuable. It's what did you actually get done? And I think that frustrates
But you know what
managers for some reason.
what I just thought about something. Remember, actually, we did talk about this in the pre-show as well, that in organization, I'm not talking about VMware per se, I'm talking about the Spring sort of a conclave of VMware, basically the Spring group. We have such a small teams,
Mm-hmm.
2 men, 3 men, 4 at best, and all the people are floating around. But the point is that I'm trying to make is that connecting between 2, 3 people is easy, but when you're talking about these big organizations like that are laying off right now because they don't want people to work remotely or whatever, I honestly do not know how would it work if you have a 20 people team, developer
Right.
team, with everybody spread around. Like, how do you gauge and manage responsibility? And obviously, without proper Scrum meetings or whatever, proper collaboration, I don't know how I would organize that.
Mm-hmm.
Because we work, like, for example, if I'm a tech leader for some project and somebody works with me, or Gary works with me, or I work with somebody on their project, like with Martian, when I have to help out something, there's always somebody, and then like takes the lead, and somebody who communicates with that person, and that's the group that will decide, and that's the group that will code, that's the group that will bring something to the finish line, however
Mm-hmm.
small, however large that is. Now, how would you do it amongst 10 people?
Sure.
It's like with meetings. I mean, if you try to decide something, make sure that you have only essential people in the room, because
Right.
the more people you bring, the less chance you have for this meeting to go anywhere.
Right. Well, and I've
So
certainly seen organizations where you invite everybody because you're like pressured to, certain people, it's like, I have to be in the room, even though they're not adding to the conversation. I was gonna almost say adding value, but that's probably a little too harsh, and it becomes part of that currency of you need to drag everybody into
we
it.
do have similar things, but for example, if I know that I have to discuss, debate something that may be a bit controversial or a bit sort of like off the edge or something, I'll run it by a person, then run it by a second person, then bring 2 more people in the room and say, what do you guys think? I talked to
Sure.
Nate, I talked to Josh, we all kind of seem to agree, so here's a prototype, blah, blah, blah. All right, now we can bring, because now you sort of did a bit of a vetting, but
Right.
and you have a little bit of a confidence to go into that meeting and face the firing squad, for example.
Sure.
But like I said, it's not just about meetings; it's about just managing remotely. Like going back to that question of remote remote work and how to organize yourself. Between 2, 3 people teams, it's easy.
Sure.
Do times 10, it's definitely not. And I don't know, like I would not be a good advisor, neither probably you, because like we thankfully never had to face this type of
Right.
environment.
Yeah, and maybe that's what the reaction is to is having larger teams and some of the communication overhead that goes along with that. And I know I was talking to Chris Judd a bit about this at DevNexus, and he did point out that, and I'm paraphrasing here, but not everybody can handle the responsibility that comes along with remote. I mean, I think there are definitely some people who need more of that governance, if you will, or just however you want to phrase
Sure,
it.
no governance. I mean, the discipline, the fact that we obviously, by dressing up, by getting in a car, driving or walking or whatever to work, and being in a work environment. I mean, I've spent good 20 years. Yeah, it's different,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know. I think when it comes to programmers, like in the open source, I mean, the amount of passion we have, the amount of drive we have to do, we absolutely love what we do.
Right.
It's like like I'll retire. I'll probably the next morning I'll open up the laptop and I'll write some code, just because I'm like, In fact, this is what Gary Russell did. He said, like, why would I want to retire? I mean, I'll be writing code anyway, so might as well get paid for it.
Yeah. It's funny. It's funny you mentioned that. Neil and I were texting a little bit this morning, and that was one of his comments. He was working on a remodel over the weekend, and I said, "Well, how you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm a little sore this morning. I'm thankful that I don't have to do that for a living, And it's a great point, and I make this point to my son often. This kind of job is something you can do until you decide you don't want to do it anymore. And there's other jobs that do not have that attribute. Like your body will break down."
Yep.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the advantages that we have. But what was the other one?
Well, with the young people, I always say is that like, computer science. I mean, should I take it? It's like good money. I said, oh, don't go there for the money, because if you want to go to computer IT, to computer engineering, to information technology, if you want to only go there for the money, but if you cannot find yourself working till 3 o'clock in the morning for free, run, because this is the worst job in the world, honestly.
Yeah.
If you don't enjoy it, it's like, thank God we enjoy it and there's a way to monetize on it. But if you don't, I don't know how you can force someone to write code. I have no idea.
No. Well, you can't. It is like so many things. I do feel like it's a calling. And for example, you and I were talking about this earlier, but this morning or last night, I was working on some stuff just for a personal project, and I ran into this bug, and it was just driving me nuts. And I need to fix this. And you have to have that in order to do this job. And
it takes you 5 hours to fix it. It's something stupid, but you get instant sense of gratification. Eureka moment. You jump around like a little kid. You like all excited, like it's 3 o'clock in the morning. You're ready to go conquer the world. And and I always say is that if you cannot see yourself in that situation, run, walk away.
Right. Exactly.
Walk away.
Yes, Neil, ibuprofen is definitely a good thing as you get older. I've thought about that often. The downside of getting older is that, but of course it still beats the alternatives. So I take it all with a grain of that salt that we put in our hash earlier. But
yeah.
Simon has a book recommendation, The Programmer's Brain. I don't think I'm familiar with that one, Simon. I may have to dig that one up. I'm a huge fan of Prag Programmer for sure. I think that's one that has had a huge impact on me, but I'll have to search for that one. But I do think that is one of the interesting challenges in software as these systems have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And I know Kent Beck has talked a bit about this, that our brain hasn't grown, so we have to come up with new ways of sharding the app basically so that it fits into our brain. Because I've talked to a friend of mine that was at GitHub for a long time, and he said even the original engineers don't know the entire code base because you just can't. It's just too big. Spring's the same way. I mean, there's nobody that knows the entire code base.
And actually, I'm glad you brought it up, because I had this one conversation with none other than Jürgen Haller a long time ago. It was Oredev, Sweden. Oredev.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Sweden. No, actually, that conversation was a different conversation. That was in Bulgaria. Josh and I, we had this Java 2 Days conference, and in 2011, 2012. And so I asked Jürgen, because like one of the sort of a famous thing within Spring thing is like organizations, like you've been organized where, and what that meant is back in the days is that when you do a commit to a Spring core, usually what follow after the commit is like few extra commits from Jürgen, polishing. Well, he will realign, we'll do something minor like housekeeping issues. And
sure.
when you sort of like have a commit and there's no polishing from Jürgen, you've been finally organized because your code is up to the standards. So I actually had a conversation with Jürgen about this. I said, listen, why? I said, I find it extremely amazing that you do this and we all love it, but why are you doing this? And he's like, listen, like, I don't know where I'm going to be 5 years from now. I certainly don't know where you're going to be 5 years from now. But if I'm still here 5 years from now, and I'm looking at your code, I want to look at it as if I wrote it.
Sure.
And to me, that kind of made a whole, like, lot of sense. Saying, listen, there's certain value in the fact that, like, we have all our like Spring style where we carry over the else, on a new line, catch on a new line. That there is certain styles that we maintain, and certain ways we do things, because it just like I've obviously looked through a lot of lines of Spring code within many different projects. Never had a problem understanding
Right.
what's going on, because it just follows certain patterns. I mean, it's not just about style. It's like style is the easy part. It's like the other things. Like, for example, don't do like a check if a collection has elements in there. Just has to have this collection utils, because it will check for both null and this, right? So you and just so many different things that you do within Spring code base that makes that code base is very easy to understand, read, build on top of, and so on.
Right, right. Well, I mean, it's funny you mentioned that. I had a conversation this morning with Dan Vega. I had him look at some of the stuff that I've been writing again for this little personal thing. And, there was a couple things where he's like, we could do it this way or that way. And I said, well, my inner architect says this. And he's like, well, the answer is it depends. And they're both fine. It's just, what do you prefer? And I think that's one of those things that can drive you nuts in this space too, because there are probably 7 ways to do this that are all equally going to get you to the same place. That was one of the conversations I had this morning. Like, well, this works. He's like, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Well, I mean, my first commit to Spring integration was the actually header value router. It was maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 lines of code. By the time Mark merged it, it was 2 lines of code.
Sure.
Apparently, there were some utility classes that I missed that I could have, or some abstract classes that I missed that I could have gotten the code from, and
Sure.
and all of a sudden, actually, the final class ended up to be 2 lines of code. None of them were written by me, but my
Sure.
name is still in the author tag, which again I think is rightfully so, because the original idea came from, like like the funny thing, we have like a lot of interfaces, like has one method and an interface that has like 3 authors. I'm like, really? but then you realize how much effort it took, because if you look at the history of it, what it was, what it became,
Right.
how much debate it took. Yeah.
Right. Well, and I mean, to me, that's a good example of all of us are smarter than one of us. And that's one of the things I do love about this space is taking what I wrote, and it's a little, I mean, intimidating, because I'm not as much of a Spring expert as Dan or Glenn, who kind of helped me get started on this thing. I very much want their input, and I'm hoping this week I can sit down with Deshaun and to be like, hey, walk through this and give me a code review and help me do this better, because I know there's things that I don't know about, or there's a better way. And you take something like Spring that's been around. Yeah. So this is part of what Dan and I were talking about. You Google and you find something, and it's like, well, is that the way I should be doing it today in Spring 6, Boot 3, or is that correct? But there's a better way to do it now, and it's really hard to know all that. And that's where having smart people that you can bounce stuff off of is incredibly valuable.
Exactly. And again, not be afraid to ask the question.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's no such thing as stupid question. I mean, there are, but
I mean, I think that can be one of the challenges, right? Is having allowing yourself to be vulnerable, to say, hey, show me how to do this better.
Well, show me how to do this better is different than show me how to do this, because the show me how to do this is already kind of goes into the area of a stupid question, because show me how to do this often, not always, I mean, obviously there's exceptions to the rule, but often means that you haven't really even tried. You just wanted me to show you how to do this. Show me how to do this better means that you tried it, you've succeeded, but you're also humble enough to realize that, while it's working, I just can't imagine that I'm that good, that there's not a better way of getting from point A to point B.
Right.
And now we can say, okay, well, actually, this is good, but, and a lot of times when I was in this type of situations, I was like, oh, shoot, I didn't know you can do that. Like, I would learn something from you, like, oh, really? You're like, oh, yeah, of course, I've been doing it for a decade.
Well, I ran into that very early on in my career. I was working on a billing application and got this super simple task. It was one of the very first things they had me do, and my tech lead borderline like pseudo coded it all out for me. But it was essentially go into this routine. We want to capitalize address or whatever, and then here's the routine you should use for capitalization. And I'm staring at this routine, and I'm like, well, this is really complicated. This takes like 17 arguments. It should take like one, the string to capitalize. This doesn't seem like it should be that hard. And I'm like, the language has got to do this for me. And so I Googled, and well, it probably wasn't Google at that time, but I searched, and sure enough, that's built right into the language. And so I just used that. And so fast forward to my team meeting, and we're going around, what'd you work on? And I talk about my little capitalization assignment, and someone says, oh, so you use that routine that so-and-so wrote? No, I just used the built-in language feature. Every head in that room looked at me, and I was by far the least experienced programmer in that room. None of them knew that that was baked into the language. I don't know when it got added. I don't know why they didn't use it. I don't know if this was a case of we've always done it that way. It's not.
I've encountered encountered this type of thing, and this is one of the reasons why I had to leave, or the COBOL world got really boring to me, is because you have some guy who's spent like last 35, 40 years there. He is fully institutionalized, and it's like the same question. Oh, you use that routine from Bob, right? That he wrote 20 years ago. I said, no, I wrote my own. We didn't have much reusability in terms of like language features, but I looked at the Bob routine and I said, listen, I see what he's doing, but I can do it in 10 times less lines of code.
Right.
But then you have to that is where like people still get sort of sometimes in those type of environments could get insulted by that. So you have to be like very careful.
Diplomatic.
Diplomatic,
yeah. Well, and Neil's got an interesting point here about, yes, it's a calling, it pays well. But he'll spend a lot of time proving something out, even though he doesn't have a client that needs it or wants it. But I just wanted to try this out. And
I wholeheartedly agree with that statement.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And
while you're doing that, you learn something extra, and that's and honestly, like, here's another interesting point to that. The kids right now graduate from computer science without realizing that everything they learn is already obsolete. Right? So think about, okay, well, let's say, like you graduated, like let's say early 2000, you learned Java and everything else. So how many iterations of Java happened since then? How many other initiatives, frameworks, and everything else? So whatever it is you learn in college, I mean, back then it was already borderline obsolete. Right now it's like, might as well don't even go to college, right? So so yeah, it's like, if you can't, in this job, if you cannot force yourself, say, listen, I'm going to have to progress. I have to learn things. I have to continue my self-education, because maybe sometimes take some courses or read some books, Google around. Yeah, you have to constantly stay on top of things, because whatever you learn, whatever you properly, doctor learns something. I mean, yeah, okay, there's some innovation happening in the industry, but that's pretty much, a lot of things remain static. But not in our industry. It doesn't. In fact, in our industry, things happen moving so quick that,
Well, I mean, this has been one of my frustrations, especially when people who don't understand software, they never seem to be able to grok why we can't give them an exact date on when something's going to be done. And we always try to compare this to other industries, like, oh, building a house is fairly predictable, which it really isn't, by the way. If you've ever done home renovation and you've ever worked with a contractor, and they're all going to say, oh, that's like
process right now.
Yep. And how long is this project? Oh, it'll be like, 4 to 6 weeks. And then 3 months later, you still have a half demolished kitchen or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So, predictability in any space is not what people want to think it is. But you get into software, and I feel like we are constantly building things that we've never built before, using tools that we invented 5 minutes ago. And people are just stunned that we don't have an exact idea of how long this is going to take.
Well, it's that, but also on top of that, it's like, when I had this when I worked for insurance companies before and other banks and stuff, and you always face the same question with the business analyst, and I said, "Oh, sure, I can give you exact date." I actually said I would go the opposite direction and say, "I can give you exact date as long as you tell me that the requirement you just gave me will not change one bit,
Right.
not one word,
Right.
nothing. That this is like a Bible. This is what I'm going to take word by word."
Hmm.
It's like, well, and we can, we have to find out. I'm like, okay, well, that's really the problem because while I'm taking this and planning for that, you're going to call me next week and tell me that we're going to need to add this, and I'm like, well, wait a second, you don't realize that what you just introduced completely changes things
Right.
in the code level. Like you don't.
Right.
Like, what do you mean? It's just a little thing. I'm like,
Conceptually,
let me
but
show you how little
right.
that thing is. Like,
Well, and I think to your point, it's because so many people look at it, it's like all you're doing is typing, and I can rewrite
sure,
an email or a document. It doesn't take any time at all. So why does it take so long for you to rewrite this code? Because it's not typing. The typing's the easy part. To your point earlier, it's
yeah,
knowing what do we got to change and how is this all going to
what to type,
refactor
yeah,
out. And I think about it, in the physical world, people don't have that problem. In the physical world, if you start building a house and you go to your builder and you say, now that I see it, I'd really like it to be bigger. So let's just push the foundation out another 10 feet. They
yeah.
don't go, oh, okay, no problem. They're like, well, that's going to change everything. And we
Yeah,
need to go get new permits and we need to go back to the city. And by the way, that's going to cost you lots and lots of money and time. At no
and
point,
structurally now we need different beams, different this,
yep.
different that, because for the
Yep.
weight and I'm
And
like,
and at
oh,
no
so that's
point
you.
would you as the homeowner be like, how dare you tell me, sir, you cannot change anything because I asked for this change. And then in software, people do that all the time. They're like, why does this change the date?
Yeah, and it's like just with the contracts. I'd rather them say, listen, I know that this might be a problem, big problem, small problem. Let me just run it by you. You tell me. When you
Sure.
approach me like this, then we can collaborate. We can work on that. Say, uh, let me try. Let me see what I can do.
Sure.
Then getting into confrontational mode and say, look, what do you mean is going to add another month to the project? Well,
Right.
you know, now since you're talking to me like this, it's probably going to add 2 months or 3 months. Because now I have to be extra careful because now I have to cover my ass too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
I hope that as more people sort of grow up digital natives, maybe will start to understand that better, that it isn't just a small matter of implementation detail, as I like to say as an architect, that some of these changes have fairly massive repercussions. And, I think that's where we really have to partner with folks to help them understand, hey, this is you and I working to deliver a solution for you. And let's have a
we actually,
conversation.
I actually had a good experience at an insurance company. It was, I got lucky. I got ended up in the greenfield development team, a whole brand new project. It was like a flagship project for the company, and what they did, they put us all in the attic. They refurbished that space, so they hired a construction crew. They put both us, the development team, and business analysts all on the same
Yeah.
floor.
Yeah.
Fairly small room. We had like a big quad cube, so it wasn't like we were not sitting in isolation. So, and they were interchangeable. First quad is programmers, the other quad is business analysts. So we were always in direct communication. So if somebody
Yeah.
comes up with something, the business analyst, like they could have just, we can hear them talking about something. Like, no,
Right.
no, 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 that's not going to work. you know.
Right. I do
So, and
think
that was
that's
a
one
great
thing that's,
experience. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a hard thing to replicate in a remote world. I am
Oh no,
sympathetic to that.
possible.
Yeah. And so I certainly, that was one of the things I really enjoyed about project rooms, is because everything was in that adjacent possible. And, you didn't have to be involved in every conversation, but you could hear people are like, wait, you want to do what to the database? Like, whoa, hold up a
Right.
sec here. We should have a bigger conversation about that.
Right. Yeah, we were constantly, but I'm also like going back to the conversation, like I'm, like listening and thinking. I could never understand. Are you hurting yourself, you being a company, like giving the amount of work Spring has done,
Mm-hmm.
the amount of influence it has around, like basically Spring is Java, Java is Spring. It's almost like becoming a synonymous thing. And with such small teams, like what's the point of having 20, 30, 40, like show me this, like literally how many lines of code, let's compare how many lines of code And maybe actually, like maybe you end up with more lines of code than you need, more lines of code than you needed because,
Mm-hmm.
like, maybe I'm saying something controversial, but I don't see a need. I cannot imagine a project where you would need 20, 30 developers.
Sure.
Like, like honestly, like I said, challenge me or somebody,
Sure.
but like I don't know what it like because 20, 30 developers means that you need that much typing because to
Right.
make the decision how to go around this or that, two, three good skilled developers and architects will do the job, and then typing. By now, we're all fast typers
Right.
to a certain extent.
Right. Yeah, and I feel like that's at least part of why there's been that migration towards, at least in some situations, the more modular distributed architectures with these smaller surface
Yeah,
areas. Because I think that, as we talked about earlier, and I can't remember if this was pre-show or earlier today, but the communication overhead of adding more people, that's that network effect. The more people you have to run things by or get in the loop, that's where the
right.
challenge is. And so I feel like so much of what we've tried to do in software is how do we decompose the problem down so that it is something that is attackable by a small team of, whether that's a 2 pizza team, whether that's, a couple of
Right.
pairs, we can debate again around the edges, but no, I agree. I think when you have massive teams, it can in many ways make the problems worse. I think Brooks wrote about that, if memory serves.
I'm almost sure that it's making matters worse. That,
Mm-hmm.
like if something is not working out in your project, don't bring another developer. Find out what's going on with your current staff
Mm-hmm.
before you bring somebody else because it's really um, like if like it's like when I was working on one of my projects, Sprinkler function, right? So I was basically a one-man team, and when I was lobbying to get help, I actually had a specific need for the help because one of the areas that I had to cover is Sprinkler function with AWS, Sprinkler function with Microsoft Azure,
Mm-hmm.
and once you get into that, it's the amount of setup that you have to do, like the environment for the proper testing, proper understanding of, let's say, Azure and then AWS
Sure.
and then other cloud platforms. And I'm like, I between coding, between all the other things, I would really like to have help in the area where, for example, like now I do have that help, where somebody can take, let's say, Azure part and know it inside out, know everything and anything. Kind of became lead in that, and to have an environment for proper testing, for proper, diagnosing and everything else, because knowing all the little tricks and stuff like that. So
Right.
it's like that's the area where you would need help. But again, uh, I could argue that okay, I could have the same person doing both AWS and Azure while I'm doing the core, and that's it. We're perfectly set. I don't need more than 2 people, more than 3 people.
Sure. Sure.
So it's like unless you have a specific need, if you're just saying, "Oh, we have a headcount for 5 more people, let's just hire them." Well, you just killed your project.
Well, and sometimes I know that that's a way of keeping score. How big is your team? Well, I have 15 people. Well, I only have 12. Well, you must be more important than me because you have more headcount. I certainly have seen that in organizations where it has at
Uh,
least something to do with that. But
Thank God we don't have that.
no, I mean, I have been extremely happy with both the Pivotal Days and now in the VMware. I'm delighted with our management chain. Maybe I've just gotten lucky. I mean, I've said multiple times how much I enjoy working for Tasha. There was
Oh,
something that happened last week where I slacked her back and said, like, that's reason number some very large number why I love working for you. And there's just no getting around
yeah.
it. It matters in such a big way. And
No,
I wish. Well, go ahead.
no, I'm saying like within Spring organization, we historically had a pretty good team and people who ended up in the management roles. I mean, as you're probably aware, I mean, we rarely hire a manager from the side. It's basically
Right.
internal promotion. Somebody who's been like, look at Michael Minella, for example.
Hmm.
I best manager I ever worked for.
Right.
Um, and it just we there's a mutual respect between one another within a small group. So the people who ended up in certain roles, it just simply signifies that his responsibility or her responsibility is slightly different than my responsibility.
Right.
But I know that, for example, someone like Michael, someone like Jason right now, completely and fully understand my issue because each and every single one of them, first and foremost, is a developer.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have to explain him the life of the developer and all these things that we just discussed. It's well understood.
Yeah, I wish there was a formula that you could use to come up with that, because I mean, I've had some phenomenal managers and I've had several that not so much. And boy, when you're on a good team with good management, oof, life is good.
Well, I honestly, a formula, one of the formula, don't become a manager unless you really believe that you can be a good manager. Like I've been offered it, within my career many times to take on a management track, and I said, I suck as a manager.
Yeah.
I don't have that much the level of organization that required by the manager, and and knowing that it's not just me now, I have people responsible that I'm responsible for.
Mm-hmm.
I said, no way. It's not going to work. I'd rather continue the engineering track and see how far I can reach there, but I don't want to become somebody who I already know I'm not going to enjoy. I have no passion for it. So a lot of people take it as a sort of a natural promotion within their career, regardless of whether they're good or bad. Mm-hmm. So in other words, it's a self-evaluation. It's like, do you really believe you can be a good manager?
Right. Well, it's a very different skill set for sure. And I think that in too many instances, especially in technology, you reach a point where, well, in order for us to give you more money, we got to put you in management. And I think that's something that is solvable, is having parallel tracks that are really, truly parallel where, hey, if you're a whatever level, you're equivalent to a director, and we're going to treat you like a director and pay you like a director.
I think this is what we sort of currently have within VMware. I think the industry quickly realized that you cannot just make a great engineer, a great manager. It's not going to work, right? So, but if you cannot pay a great engineer his natural progression of raises and bonuses and stuff like that, you're going to lose him.
Right.
So they needed to come up with the idea of saying, listen, how can we solve that problem? And we have this equal sort of tracks.
Yeah, no, I think that's something VMware has done incredibly well is to make that clear that those are parallel and not subservient in any way, shape, or form. But so one thing I wanted to wrap up with is, you've talked about Philly, you lived there for a long time. You're in France now. How did you end up deciding to move to France, especially the south of France, which just sounds like a beautiful place to live?
Well, that's the answer to your second question. Why? So obviously it's very beautiful here. It's kind of like, sorry, all this early conversation we had about remote work and everything. It's like, what other benefit can you extract from the fact that you have remote work, right? And so now you can actually live anywhere. Like you can live anywhere as long as there's internet and airport close by, and so all of those things become possible. So all of a sudden you start thinking that because of this remote work, that you work on a plane, you work on the beach, you work here, you work there, you can live anywhere. So when my wife and I we are one of those people who travel a lot historically. We love travel. We like visiting other countries, other places. So we just at some point of time realized that very often, more often than not, like we've been to many places around the world, but more often than not, we end up in Europe because we're both from Ukraine, and so first of all, close to home, and cultural-wise, we're closer to, for example, like I'm pretty American, but for example, my wife is still kind of like more of a European Ukrainian girl, and again, I just culturally, for example, like I miss like the football, well, the soccer, all these little things. So we've been traveling to Europe, France quite often, more often than there's a couple other places, and south of France, as I just said, it's a extremely beautiful place. And there's like two parts of it. There's this we're inland, like Provence, and there's also the French Riviera, so which is about an hour drive, which is quite different because it's extremely crowded. It's a nice place, but only certain times of the season.
Sure.
But yeah, so one day we were just we start taking this work. There's a new word for that. Workation, like when you. I heard it in the movie.
Sure. Where you like relocate to, you're going to work from somewhere else.
Yeah. So basically, like I would spend a month with Airbnb or something, and you just work, right? So you don't take vacation, you just work here. And so we've done it and a couple times, and then we just start shopping for a place. We kind of settled in the area where we want to be, and we made an offer. We started going through the process, and then it was just kind of crazy because we were in the process of buying a house, and only then afterwards Michael said,
"Hey,
I was wondering how difficult would it be to relocate like, let me talk to Brian."
Right.
And then the rest is history. Yeah, so.
Right. Oh, that's awesome. I know, ironically enough, this shirt, the time we were in Paris for SpringOne, my family came with me, and I very distinctly remember being at a cafe, the three of us, we were just having a wonderful afternoon, and the topic came up, like, could we here? Like, what would that look like? How would that be? And it's kind of, you start to kind of play it out, and you go, that's not such a dumb idea. Well, maybe when the kid's out of college,
Right. We basically we knew that we were going to move from Philly, so we just couldn't stand the humidity anymore. So it was either go Midwest, like to Colorado, Arizona, whatever, or like California, which thank God we're not going there, and or somewhere in Europe.
Sure.
And well, not somewhere. We kind of knew exactly what it was.
Sure. Oh, well, that's fascinating. Well, Oleg, I could keep chewing on your ear here, but I know it's late in the evening for you. I know it's a holiday. I know I cut into your run, so I do apologize for that. But thank you.
No, it's okay,
my friend. It has been a pleasure as always. I think it would be funny to try to go back. Again, you talk about that 07 SpringOne, and I'm 99% certain I was actually there. It might have been at the very end of it, but I'd be curious to know how many other times
in Hollywood, Florida. Well, I've obviously every SpringOne after that, but yeah, it was a fun time.
Yeah. Well, here's fingers crossed that we're going to be in the same physical space sometime in 23 or 24, and we can go get a cup of coffee or a beverage or something like that.
SpringOne.
Well, that's true. We'll be together in Vegas, I suppose, in August. So I always forget about that. But yeah, we'll be. So what's it? 21,
we're just talking about Florida in July. Well, Vegas in August is.
It's going to be about but it'll be a dry heat, as they say.
Yeah.
So I guess we got that going for us.
Right. But I don't think giving the setup in Vegas, we rarely be leaving the hotel. Everything's there.
That's a fair point. I think you can pretty much walk the entire length of the strip without going inside if you really want to. So.
Oh yeah.
We'll see. It's been a long time since I've been to Vegas, so I'm very curious to see what it's like. And
no, I was just there for my son's wedding, so.
Oh, fantastic! Awesome. Well, I'll see you there in August then. I guess we'll throw that on the calendar.
Thank you, Nate. It was a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, pleasure was all mine. And let's see, who do we got coming up next week? Next week we've got Valentina will be with me, so that'll be fun, and see what kind of trouble that gets us into, and then we'll just keep cranking at it. So, thank you again, my friend. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Nate. I'll talk to you later. Cheers.
Sounds good. Bye.